we're going to start. So for everyone who doesn't know, this is Dr. Megan Miller. She's a doctoral level behavior analyst. I believe you teach. I think you're seeing clients. And you also run the Do Better movement and do a bunch of CEUs. You're very, very busy. So again, thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with us.
Yes. I've also been traveling quite a bit, so I'm very busy, more so than usual.
Right. All right. So what I was thinking we could do is maybe we'll go through the pre-written questions for the first hour and see how you're feeling and see how far we get. And then maybe we could have people ask live questions if they so desire, and then decide to keep going or call it or however you're feeling. How does that sound?
Right.
All right. Well, I say let's just dive into it. Because we have quite a few. I'm definitely interested to hear some of your answers. All right. So question number 1. What would you say is the most important or efficacious thing for patients can be doing outside of sessions for trauma?
So just a disclaimer, I don't have expertise in trauma necessarily. My focus in behavior analysis has been autism, and I do a lot of work helping people make sure they're not causing trauma for autistic clients, but I haven't done any specific training in trauma. So for that question, I would probably say I'm not the best person to ask, and having a qualified therapist to help you navigate your trauma and lean into the work that needs to be done is probably the main thing I would suggest.
Okay.
Based on the little bit I know.
And definitely, if you don't know, that's fine. Next one. What would you say is the most valuable resource or treatment for someone with ASD level 1 to 3?
Oh, the different levels, aren't those fun? So for people that aren't super familiar, when the new DSM came out, they collapsed what used to be a few different diagnoses and put them all into one. So instead of having autism and Asperger's and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, and potentially a few others, they put all of those into one, and then they tried to add these levels. I don't even know if the doctors are familiar completely or agree upon how you come up with the levels. When I do research, and one of the things we do is the ADOS, and in there, based on the score, there's levels that you can recommend as well. But anyway, so even regardless of whether they're less impacted or more significantly affected, the main thing that I've found to be the most effective is to have active engagement, and the research shows this as well. I'm not just making it up. In the field of behavior analysis, that's not something that is discussed often. In the research that's being done in autism more broadly, active engagement is a really big focus. And it's basically the idea that the person is actively engaged with their environment or the people around them. Doesn't necessarily matter if it's with playing or academics, leisure skills. It doesn't really matter what's going on. It just matters how connected they are with that activity and how connected the people are that are working with them. So I think that's one area that a lot of people don't necessarily attend to. So they make like a checklist of things they need to get through with a person in a day, and they don't actually look at, am I just going through the motions and like checking off that we did certain things and this person actually wasn't present and actively participating in any of it? Or did we actually take the time to make this meaningful and connected for the person that we're working with? So I would say active engagement is the number one thing, regardless of what you're working on, that needs to be measured and attended to for effective outcomes.
Okay, interesting. And then pursuant, what is the best way for teachers to engage children with ASD in an evidence-informed manner?
That relates so nicely, doesn't it? So, it really depends, of course, on the learner and, potentially what grade you're in, because obviously teaching would span quite an age range. One of the things that I frequently train people on, and they seem to have, whether it's teachers, parents, even practitioners in the field, difficulty with sometimes, is how to make that connection, how to create motivated learning environments. For a lot of us, the things that are motivating for someone with a diagnosis of autism isn't the same as what would be motivating for someone else. So people have a hard time connecting to that, and instead of honoring and accepting the things that are motivating, they actually try to push those things away and get the student to like other things. And that's not really very helpful. So for example, if you have a student who's really into elevators, they like to watch YouTube videos of elevators, they tell you every detail you could ever want to know about an elevator and how it's made and how it works and what brands there are and where you can find different elevators, all of those types of things. A teacher that is going to make more progress with their student will do everything they can to tie elevators in to the content that they're teaching or make it part of the teaching environment. Other people might say, oh, they talk about elevators too much, we need to stop them from talking about elevators, and like have a rule that they're not allowed to talk about elevators, which obviously that wouldn't be very motivating, and then that makes the learning environment a lot more aversive. So the biggest thing that I would recommend that people can do that are trying to teach would be to figure out, what are the things that genuinely are motivating for your learner, and figure out how you can connect with those authentically, not in a fake way, and incorporate that, whether it's within worksheets, within the lesson, or some other way within the day. My son just turned 6. He doesn't have a diagnosis of autism, but I'm pretty sure he's going to get a diagnosis of ADD. And he's been having a really difficult time in school. And his teacher made just a couple of little changes. And one of them is that when he gets done with his schedule for the whatever period they're in, he has a little area in the room that he can go to and play with airplanes and trash. Not real trash, but like pretend trash, because he likes to make pretend trash and then pick it up with garbage trucks. So once she just made that tiny little change, it's not even part of their lesson or anything. It's just, okay, when you finish these things, you can go over to your little area and play with this stuff that you really like. And now he loves school. And that was just one minor change that she had to make for him. So things like that are usually going to be the most effective. That are, it doesn't really matter what curriculum you're using or what other behavior management strategies you have in place if you can't figure out what's motivating for the student.
Right. Now this comes down to what's the reinforcement. What is the DoBetter Collective?
Mm-hmm. So the DoBetter Collective is an online community where we have memberships available, and our current focus right now is content that's most relevant to behavior analysts and related service providers that are working with autism, because that's my area of expertise. We do have guest presenters every month. We have a webinar and we have a mentorship session who may cover topics outside of autism and focus on different areas, but they're all behavior analytic in nature. And then we also meet weekly to discuss different topics. So this past month, the focus has been on how people are continuing to operate their businesses given all of the stress from COVID. And we just cover whatever topics the members are hoping to learn more about, and they sort of guide what those topics are going to be. And then we have different discussion areas where people can post questions and connect and network with their peers to address whatever issues they're having. We used to use Facebook, but it got really dramatic having the Facebook group and different people in there for different reasons. So with the online community, it makes it everyone's there for the same reasons and focused on the same thing. So that helps a lot. Over time, we're planning to broaden to include content for different areas. such as social work and education. And the focus with the name Do Better is that a lot of times as professionals, we kind of get stuck in a rut and something might be effective. So we just keep doing it and we get too busy to take the time to really look at what are the things that are out there that we could be doing better with to continue to improve our client outcomes. So that's where I came up with the name, is just how can we continue to grow and learn in a supportive way. And we really try to focus on doing so in a way that's humble and non-judgmental, where we're really supporting one another in whatever area of growth needs to happen.
Awesome. And then how did you end up in special education and ABA?
I feel like every answer to that question, because there's like different pieces, is just all happenstance. So when I was in undergrad, I did clinical psychology, and I thought I was going to go to school to be a lawyer. And when I was in my senior year of college, we had to do an internship. And then the closest one to me was the Cleveland Clinic Center for Autism. So I just chose that. I didn't necessarily have an interest in it. I hadn't taken any classes that would suggest doing it. I just saw that it was like 5 minutes from my house. So that's what I chose. And I really enjoyed it. There were parts that I questioned a little bit. And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in some of the other questions. But I liked it. And when I finished up undergrad, I took a year off and I worked in Columbus, Ohio, providing in-home ABA therapy for that year. And I found out while doing that you could go to grad school for behavior analysis. So by the time I found out, most of the grad schools, their application windows had closed, but Florida State, and they had a big campus in Panama City, Florida, their window was still open. So I applied to go there and I got in and I went. And then when I was living in Virginia and running my business, I was running into a lot of issues where I had really good training, because Florida State's one of the best programs. But in Virginia, most people don't know anything about Florida State. And they were selecting doctoral level people to present and do trainings that didn't have the same level of expertise and knowledge as I did. So I was getting really frustrated. And I decided I needed to go back to school to get my Ph.D. And I chose Ohio State because I was from Ohio and I'd always wanted to go to Ohio State. And their program just happens to be in the special education department instead of the psych department. So that's how I got the special education background. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the education piece of it. When I got there, they tried to make me get a separate undergraduate degree in education. So that was fun. I was taking more courses than most people. But it was really helpful. It really opened my eyes to a lot of like what teachers go through, and learning a lot about the constraints on them and how they're prepared or not prepared to handle the type of clients that we work with.
Yeah, it's good to have like that kind of different perspective too, especially if you come just from an ABA kind of standpoint.
Yes, I felt really bad for any teacher that I had previously gone into their classroom with just my master's, and was probably not very realistic at all with my expectations for them.
Yeah, I think that's something we all, especially when the first time you consult the classroom, you come to grips with really fast.
Yeah.
So it seems like you have a lot of different roles, so professor, practitioner, researcher. So how do you balance all these roles in your life?
It's definitely easier sometimes than others. For the research, it really doesn't take up a ton of my time, because it's I used to do it full time when I lived in Panama City, but when I moved, I live in St. Pete now, and when I moved here 5 years ago, there were more opportunities for them to get participants in this area because it's a bigger area. So I stayed on the research project, but I really only do that. It's like once a month. Before COVID, I would do like an assessment and meet with families. That one's pretty easy to balance because it doesn't take up a whole lot of my time. For teaching, I kind of go up and down with it. Like I won't teach a course and then someone will reach out and ask they might need help or something. and I'll agree to do it. And then every time I agree to do it, I'm like, why did I agree to do this? Because it's so time consuming. So from a teaching standpoint, I really prefer to do the type of things that we're doing in the collective that are a little bit more free flowing and don't have so many requirements around them, where I know people are learning, but I'm not constrained by, you know, assignments and grading and all of that kind of stuff. So it makes it a lot easier when I can focus the teaching part of it in that way. And then from the practitioner side, I limit how many clients I can have. And I also mostly do problem solving and coaching at this point. I don't really have the bandwidth to take on clients where I would be their responsible person doing their treatment plan and coming up with their programs and all of that kind of thing. Prior to where I am now with my career, I was mostly just a practitioner, just doing practice, like working with clients. So when I did that, it was, you know, pretty much the day to day was just seeing clients and then a little bit of supervision and those types of things. So basically, I constantly have to evaluate and look at, am I keeping up with what needs to be kept up with? And I have to have really open communication with the people that I'm serving and come up with plans sometimes to transition or change things around and bring in additional support when needed, because I'm just one person. So I have to be realistic about what I can handle and what I can't handle and be willing to admit when there's too much going on.
Okay. Yeah, and you're also a mom too, on top of all that.
Yeah.
In your field, have you ever met a child with ASD which was outside of your clinical expertise due to extraneous circumstances? For example, ASD plus a comorbid condition that interfered with therapy.
I've definitely had a few situations where there was something else going on. Usually it was medically related, like they might have a seizure disorder where every few weeks they were having a seizure, and then all the skills we were working on, you know, kind of went away. So in those situations, it's not that what we do can't be effective. I think in general, regardless of the field, whether it's education or behavior analysis or speech or OT or PT, there isn't enough out there right now on how to best support those more significant cases, and looking at, you know, what are the best things to be working on with this type of profile, because a lot of people still tend to try to work on the typical like developmental milestones and academics and those types of things. And in reality, it might make more sense to work on, you know, things relating to just functional living and how to get around the environment as independent as possible. So potentially, you know, daily living type skills like brushing teeth, washing hands, communication from a standpoint of what's meaningful to them. A lot of times I see with communication, people kind of try to fit things into a box of either sign language, pictures, or vocal communication, and they don't really actually attend to how is this person already communicating and try to promote that. And then maybe you might eventually get to one of those three modalities, but before doing that, it should be prioritized to just what are they currently doing to communicate and how can we support that and understand them. So I think it's always possible that there's going to be certain profiles and cases that are more difficult. I just wish that there were more resources. Even so, when I went to Ohio State, my advisor, her area of expertise was moderate to severe disabilities, and I have books and things that I've used. But even with all of that, the research and things like that, it's just that's the population that's often the least, you know, people are the least concerned about or really doing much with. So I think we just in general as a society need to have more resources and materials and research on how to really observe and connect with who this human is and how we can make their life the most valuable without trying to fit them into some type of developmental or academic box.
Okay. And then how can we better train and educate teachers and other professionals to work with children with ASD?
That's a wonderful question. I think one of the things that's hard is teacher training at least in America right now, is not great. It's not very good. There's a lot of competing ideas around education and what works best, and people train teachers based on their own opinions or theoretical models instead of really looking at what does the research show is most effective. So whether it's ASD or just classrooms in general, like, we're struggling. Our education system is not doing very well. So I mean, that's such a big question. I think if we're looking at autism specifically, though, it's getting out more information to teachers about what autism is and really dispelling like the myths and misconceptions around it and looking at it in a more beneficial and strengths-based way to help support the students, instead of, usually when people do trainings on autism and try to teach people about it, it's all focused on the deficits, instead of looking at what are the strengths and how can we make use of those to better the educational outcomes for these learners. So that would be my main thing, is really helping teachers and other professionals understand the benefits of an autism diagnosis and, what areas might be difficult and need some support in navigating.
Okay. Why should behavior analysts, or anyone really, use standard acceleration charts?
I love standard acceleration charts. And ultimately, they're the best way to make decisions about behavior and what changes to make. So I know one of the questions was what my dissertation was on. So for my dissertation, I looked at building up motor movement fluency. So I had 3 different motor movements and did training with 3 different students who were teenagers to help increase how fast and effortlessly they could perform these motor movements, to see what effect that had on their performance of other skills. And my advisor was not a precision teacher. So we charted my data on the standard acceleration chart, and then we also graphed it on just an equal interval. And each week when we would meet to go over my data, I would show both. And it was just so interesting to see the difference in decisions that I could make when looking at the standard acceleration chart versus the equal interval chart. With the equal interval chart, I couldn't really see, especially for one student. I had one student who had a lot of bounce, which is where like the data is going like up and down. And it was a lot clearer to see that on the standard acceleration chart. And we also could see, as the intervention progressed, her bounce, the variability got less and less, and I was able to quantify that. But on the equal interval chart, I couldn't do that, right? Like, we could say, oh yeah, it's going up and down, but it didn't look like it was going up and down as much, and we couldn't say, how much it was going up and down, like ×1, ×2, etc. So it was a lot easier for me to quantify and talk about what was happening. And even for my advisor, who doesn't understand or has never studied standard acceleration charts, she could still see, and I could explain to her, what was going on in that data. So anyway, I think just like other measurements, Rick Kubina, who was my co-advisor, and a few other precision teachers give the example of when people are looking at EKGs and things like that in medicine, they have standardized ways of quantifying and looking at what they're doing and then making decisions based off of that. And we don't have that. If we don't have the standard acceleration chart, we don't have that in behavioral sciences. And what better decisions could we make and prescribe if we could quickly look at a chart and say, oh, this person has ×2, their rate of learning is, really accelerating, so we can make this change and expect this outcome. You can't do any of that with an equal interval graph. So for that, like, the standard acceleration chart could be a whole discussion in and of itself that, Stephen, you and I could talk about for hours, I'm sure. So
yeah, definitely.
But that would be my main thing, is you can make more precise decisions using the chart.
Right. And then, so is precision teaching a cult?
Not that I've experienced. I think that's a very passionate group of people. And I think understandably so, because when you see how well the chart works and helping to guide decision making, it's hard not to be passionate about it and want to teach everyone else about it. I have experienced quite a bit of flexibility with the precision teachers that I've interacted with in they may have their set ways of doing things with the chart and other like procedures and things like that. But if you have an idea for like doing it differently, or you're not quite ready to take on all of the different aspects of what a precision teacher would be doing, they're fine. They're supportive about that. And they're like willing to walk there with you and help you get to where you need to be. Whereas in other parts of behavior analysis, that's not necessarily the case. You might get there might be some arguments and things like that. Now, I've also seen precision teachers amongst themselves, for people who are already engaging in precision teaching and have been presenting at conferences and whatnot, get into some heated debates about some preferences and things like that. But for the most part, it's just a really supportive community that is just really wants people to have better measurement systems so they can make more progress with their students.
All right, and now for some heavier stuff. Are there behaviors who are part of the fight to the end of use of punishment, particularly skin shocks? And that's probably in reference to the JRC. Yes,
so there is. There's if you do well, I'll try to get the link. Actually, there's a few different groups that are doing work on it. I'm sure if you look up the Stop the Shock hashtag, you can find some things, but there's a group of behavior analysts and I'm just pulling up their website. It's called Hops, Hooves, and Humanity. And they've been focusing a lot on the JRC, and they have some information on their website about that, where they've contacted the people at JRC, they've filed ethical complaints, they've put out different PSAs and things like that to try to coordinate action against the JRC. Just a few months ago, the Association for Behavior Analysis in Massachusetts, Mass ABA, put out a statement saying that they don't support that type of intervention from a behavior analytics standpoint. The way it was worded could have been a little bit more forceful, I think, but it's one of the first things to come out of like a professional organization in our field. So it's a step in the right direction. There's a lot of pressure on our international organization, ABAI, to do something, say something, but they still haven't. And of course, even with precision teaching, the JRC they have a pretty strong hold in a lot of the professional organizations and their sponsors, and they present at these conferences and things like that. So there's still a lot of work to be done specific to that particular place. But the court case that they had a few years ago, if you look at the documents, it's really alarming, the descriptions that are given from the JRC about how they use the shock. It's not anything in line with what they advertise. They had quite a few documents that explained that they don't conduct functional assessments, that they have students there who've been receiving that treatment for like years, which you would expect if you're going to use that intensive of a punishment procedure, you would see changes pretty quickly, despite the fact that it's not even necessary in the first place. But it is pretty scary to think that a group is allowed to provide that type of intervention. Now, there are still behavior analysts who think, based on the JRC's marketing and advertising, that it's a last resort and there's a necessity to it, and we shouldn't ban any type of treatment because it could ultimately benefit the person. But there's not enough, at least on what I've seen from it, there's not enough to support that it really is a last resort, that they really are doing everything that they could to benefit the person before getting to that point. So yes, there are behavior analysts who are working against that type of punishment, and just in general, different procedures that could be more aversive or intrusive for learners. There's a much larger movement. When I first started presenting on what I call alternatives to escape extinction. Like 10 years ago, hardly anyone was talking about it. It was myself and my colleague, Robert Schramm. We were the main two people talking about it. And now there's tons of different people presenting on that topic and sharing resources and procedures and research that they're doing. Dr. Hanley's one of the biggest ones right now. Then you'll see different Instagram handles and things about compassionate behavior analysis or trauma-informed behavior analysis. So we're definitely moving in a different direction, but there's still a lot of work to be done on getting rid of procedures that could be traumatic, whether they're using punishment or extinction, or even just even reinforcement, depending on how it's applied. So, so there is a lot of work to be done, but there are behavior analysts that are working on trying to make those improvements.
Okay, and then are trauma-informed practices being integrated into ABA? So I guess that's more of a how.
Yeah. So they are in a few different ways. There's certain behavior analytic practitioners who have done additional training in trauma, and there's various different trauma certificates you can get. So Dr. Camille Kolu is one of the big ones that's doing research in that area. And my colleague, Emily Wilson, has done quite a bit. She's not like a researcher or anything like that, but she's a boots on the ground clinical practitioner, and she's did her certification in trauma before I think even people talked about it. So, and Dr. Jeannie Golden, who's in North Carolina, she's been presenting on trauma and trauma-informed care for like 20 years now. She works mostly with foster care and foster parents. But so I think there's a couple different levels. There's that where people are going and getting additional training and certifications in trauma. And then there's also just people who are looking at the procedures they're using and critically analyzing how those procedures could potentially have a negative impact for their clients, and looking at that cost-benefit analysis of, is this really the way we need to do this, or are there better ways that we could be working with our clients? And for like extinction in particular, even in the late 90s, when a lot of the research was first coming out on extinction, the researchers at that time said, this, other things need to be found. Like, yes, this works, but there are side effects, and we should see what other procedures we can come up with. And since that time, people have been researching mostly differential reinforcement procedures without the use of extinction, where you can provide reinforcement for whatever challenge is happening and provide a different level of reinforcement and training for replacement behaviors, and you can still see a change in the responding. So some people are just relying, some people are relying on the research that shows we don't need to use these more intensive aversive procedures. There are better ways to do things. And then there's a big focus on assent, looking at, is the client a willing and active participant, or have they voted with their feet? And this is not something we should be doing right now. So some of those are just looking at our overall practices and how people can make sure that they're, truly following our ethical code and truly benefiting the learners that they're working with. And you don't need any special training for that, but there's other people who have more of an interest in the trauma side and want to work with populations that have had significant trauma. So to do that, you typically need to get additional training.
Okay. Now for some more theoretical questions. Is reinforcement real?
So I'm also going to give a disclaimer here. I'm not the best with theoretical questions, so I'll try my best to answer, but I'm usually more of a, I did this thing and it worked. I would say, generally speaking, yes, there's pretty decent research to show that depending on whatever consequence happens after behavior, you can see an increase in future responding. I would say part of it is is contrived or controlled reinforcement necessary? I think, especially for behavior analysts, far too often we know how to change the consequence and promote the occurrence of a behavior and like make it happen super fast. But there's not necessarily a thought about, is that actually necessary though? Or should we be looking more at like naturally occurring contingencies and seeing how the responding develops on its own? And I've seen this with tons of like behavior analytic parents who will sit their kids down and do flashcards with them and things at an age where it's like not even appropriate to be doing it, but just to be able to say like, well, my kid knows all this stuff. And it's like, okay, not to say that's necessarily harmful for the child or anything, but it's like, just because we could, does that mean we should? So I think sometimes, well, I know reinforcement is definitely real, but how it's applied, how we apply what we know about it is maybe needs to be a little bit better analyzed and controlled, because it shouldn't just be something that adults do to children to like make them do the things they want them to do. There should be a connected interaction around it and like really be of value to the person that's having that consequence applied.
Okay, interesting. Then, is response strength a hypothetical construct?
This is one that I'm not even really sure if I have an answer to. Can you elaborate at all on that one? Do you have any context for it?
So, a colleague of mine, he's in this call right now in the audience. We read a very fascinating paper, and maybe I can send it to you after, that talked about how, well, reinforcement is a thing, obviously. We do it for 50 years, maybe longer. But we haven't really, as a field, kind of dug down into more what is actually happening with reinforcement. And then a lot of papers talk about response strength, but it's sometimes not really clear what that means. But we kind of assume it in our practice, right? Like even with an SEC, we kind of, if we're trying to teach a client to do something, I don't know, like if they're raising their hand up and down to work on fine motors or whatever, we might say that because their rate of response is increased, that response is stronger. You see what I'm saying? We talk about strength in this way, and I guess the question is this a hypothetical construct in ABA? If that explanation made any sense.
I don't know.
It's okay. I'll send you the paper.
I'm
like I said, I'm
really bad at theoretical things.
Yeah. Well, that's okay.
I would definitely send me the paper though, and maybe I can leave a comment at some point if I think of something after reading it. Sure.
What major area of research and behavior analysis are you excited about?
I'm definitely love the work that Dr. Hanley and his colleagues are doing with practical functional assessment and skills-based treatment. I'm curious to see where it goes, because when it first started, it was really exploratory and lots of creative things happening. And then, as does happen in our field and most fields, it gets kind of more and more specified. Okay, this is a procedure and this is what we do. So I'm curious to see if there's continued creative out of the box type research that happens with that, or if it kind of gets put into a little spot and then the research just continues to be the same over and over. I haven't honestly seen the research happening as much as I would like to see, but I do know there are people interested in looking at how our research can be better in serving the people that we're researching. So Dr. Malika Pritchett had her dissertation was called Social Justice as the Aim of Behavior Analysis. And she talks about colonial research practices and all of the different things that are done in research that are colonial in nature and potentially harmful for the participants. And she gives some suggestions on how to address that. And one of the main things that she talks about is having more community participatory research. So I'd really like to see that grow, where researchers are really connecting with the populations that are being served asking them what they would like us to do, developing interventions based on their input, and then showing progress based off of that, instead of what I typically see happen where it's someone has a research line and they find a convenient population to try to prove whatever idea they've come up with.
Okay. And that's good because I actually accidentally skipped that question of what efforts are being made to include the voices of autistic consumers in behavior analysis.
Yeah. And I know, like, I don't know what Mari Serta is doing. She's getting her Ph.D. right now, and I know she's doing research. She's an autistic BCBA in Texas. I don't know what her research is, but I'm assuming it's going to incorporate something along those lines. And then Ashton Holt is in California, and she's also an autistic BCBA, and I definitely know she's doing research. One of her studies, she interviewed people who received early intervention, early behavioral intervention, so EIBI, and to find out what effects it had for them in terms of trauma. And then she's also looking at how to better create our procedures to be informed to avoid having those types of impacts. So I'm really looking forward to her research being published and her presentations on that.
Definitely. What do you think of cognitive psychology?
Well, when I did my undergrad, that was one of the main theoretical approaches that we studied, and I actually did one of my other internships with a cognitive behavioral psychologist at the Cleveland Clinic, and I loved it. It was the only thing that really seemed to have, of course, nobody was talking about behavior analysis where I was, but it was the only thing that seemed to have any type of positive benefit out of the different, theoretical approaches that we looked at. So I don't have any problems with it. I do think from it, when you look at acceptance and commitment therapy and the work that's being done there, I think combining, which is essentially part of what ACT does, some of the approaches from cognitive behavioral psychology and how to change thoughts to change behavior, that type of stuff, looking at combining it with the acceptance piece too, seems to be more beneficial, especially in the research. So I think it's, for me at least, there's various things that exist, whether it's different aspects of psychology or other disciplines, where if we get locked into one way of doing things, we're going to miss out on something that could be beneficial for someone. So I know it's kind of impossible to learn about everything, but I do think we need to be open and curious about when we encounter different, theories and methods, looking at how that aligns with what you're doing and if any of it could make what you're doing more effective. I was definitely trained initially, both because I was a debater and just life, to not do that, to just this is my box, I'm a behavior analyst, I only do this thing. And then it's you miss out on other beneficial things that people are doing that if you learn more about, you could kind of integrate that into what you're doing. So I don't have any issues with cognitive psychology. I do think, again, there's ways to kind of blend together the various pieces of psychology to make the most beneficial outcomes for a client. But of course, that takes a lot more work than just learning about one theoretical approach.
Definitely. And then again, so kind of jumping off what you said at the end, do you think that the differences between cognitive psychology and behavior analysis are more semantic?
Probably at some level. I think for behavior analysts, there's a certain way that behavior analysts prefer to talk about things to avoid, mentalism and things like that cognitive psychology doesn't necessarily care if you talk about it that way. So I think that's a big part of it. There's a really nice article, which I still don't even really know if it's an article or not. It's called The Third Wave of Behaviorism, and it's by Steve Hayes, and it was from 1994 or 1995. It was like his presidential address for the Association of Contextual Behavioral Science. And in that, he talks about, you know, kind of the progression of behaviorism, and the third wave being incorporating more pieces of cognitive behavioral psychology and like the work that's been done on emotions. And I think it's really fascinating, and I think it provides a really well-rounded way of looking at how can we, you know, all kind of be in one space together and benefit the learners that we're working with. So he puts it in such better words than I could. But I really think that it is, a lot of it's just like the issues more so on the side of behavior analysis, of people wanting to be really particular about how we talk about something and not looking at what benefit or gains could happen if we would just listen to what's being presented to us.
Okay. Does behavior analysis have an issue with racism and sexism?
Yes, and so does everything else. It's pretty impossible with the systems that exist today for you not like to get away from that. Ableism, sexism, racism, like all of the isms are inherently part of the structures that exist at this point. So I think, you know, to try to deny that would be really difficult. I think generally speaking, there's a larger number of folks in our field who are working to actively address and acknowledge that and see what solutions we can come up with. And there's also still some people who think because we're a science, we can be objective and like none of that stuff matters or factors in. So that's problematic. But especially the article from Malika, the social justice article, really highlighted some key data on like how differently people are treated just in research based on race. So yes, it definitely exists, and I think it's going to be a while before it's fully addressed. And if, especially from like the sexism angle too, a lot of the leaders in our field are still white men. And when you see who's invited to present at conferences and to be editors or lead different groups, it's usually still the white men that are being invited to do those things. There has been a shift, but it's not, especially since our field's like 80% women at this point, it's not really representative of our field. So there's a lot of work to still be done, but I don't think it's because behavior analysis as a practice or a science is racist or sexist. It's just the system that it's coming from.
Okay. If someone wanted to do what you do, what path would they take?
Just say yes to things. No, I mean, to most people that get into behavior analysis usually don't even get into it until after they've received their undergrad, and some just after they've already had their master's as well. So depending on where you are in your life, if you're still working on your undergrad, you could get your degree in psychology or even education, and look for different master's programs in psychology or education that have a behavior analytic track. There's a lot of universities now, online and in person, that offer that. If you already have your master's and it's in psychology or education, and they've opened it back up again, so it could really be in any field, you just can take there's a course sequence specifically for behavior analysis. Most people, when they do that, they do it online. And then you have to do an internship or, field work hours and pass an exam and all of that kind of stuff. I would definitely recommend, if there's certain populations you're wanting to work with, that you don't just pick any random program, but you try to find a program where people are working with those populations so you can get experience and training in that area. USF here in the Tampa area is really well-rounded. They have a lot of different research lines and tracks that people can go down. So they have ones focused on autism. They have ones focused on sports and fitness, safety skills, education, parenting. So they have a lot of different options for people depending on what their interests are. And it's rare to find universities that have that. They're out there. but USF is one of the most, I think, well-rounded options. If you go do any like random online program, you're not really going to get that. So if you really think you have like you want to specialize in something, I would try to do an in-person route and like find people that are studying what you want to study.
Okay. What's your favorite DoBetter course?
Well, technically it's one that my web developer hasn't put up yet, so I need to check with him this week and find out when it's coming out. I recorded a new workshop in December, and it's called Cultivating Curious and Compassionate Behavior Analysts, and it was like a 6-hour workshop focused on how can we train people to provide services that are more humane and compassionate to their learners. And I have a bunch of different resources and programming examples and things like that that we use. And there's a huge focus on shaping, but that one's not published yet. So my other one that I really like is the early intervention one. It's called EI What I Wish I Knew in graduate school, and it just focuses on some of the advancements that have been made in early intervention, but some of them are more, they're not necessarily things that behavior analysts are getting trained on or studying in school, and they're more from just like the general research in early intervention. So I talk about the Early Start Denver model, pivotal response, the Autism Navigator, which is part of the research that I'm doing at Florida State, and go through, how can we make use of this research to better our practices for early intervention, the like birth to 5 population. And that one is available for free for people that like, if you're working in early intervention or you just want to know more about what we do, we do have a free offering for that one. If you are a behavior analyst and you want CEs, there's a paid option as well.
Okay, pretty neat. So I'll have to check it out. I'll share it with the group. Our last question before we hit that hour mark, probably. Who's your favorite autistic content creator?
There's so many. I'll put a link in the chat. I have this Google Doc that I created that has different resources relating to Autistic Voices. So I have a few different Instagram accounts on there. There's two that I'll mention just because they're the ones that I read a lot. Well, actually 3. So the first is, I already mentioned Mari Serda. She kind of changes her name on Instagram a bit. I think right now it's Autie Analyst, AUTIE Analyst. So she's an autistic BCBA. She's really focused on having better practices, and also she's Indigenous. So she focuses a lot on like colonialism and things like that as well. Fidgets and Fries is an autistic mother who's Black, and she writes a lot about her experiences and her sons, and that intersectionality of being Black. They use behavior analytic services and get a lot of heat for that. So she talks about that quite a bit as well. And then Neuroclastic, which is Tara Vance. She has a blog, Facebook, and Instagram, I'm pretty sure. They put out a lot of really interesting content as well, and things to think of relating to autism. And Tara was pretty strongly against behavior analysis and still tends to be. However, there has been a lot of work done between her and some of myself and some other behavior analysts that are working with her to better understand what they're going through. So she's put out a few things that are a little bit more supportive of behavior analysis when done in like different ways.
Okay. So we're at the hour mark. How are you feeling?
I'm doing okay right now.
Okay. So we said at the beginning we were going to open up the floor if anyone wanted to ask questions directly. So either you can write them in the presentation den or raise your hand and come on the stage.
I saw that there was one when we first started about favorite books. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I was going to ask what one, but it looks like that person left.
Oh.
Although you're free to answer. What's your favorite book?
Okay, so I have like a whole entire book list that I was using and then kind of was one of my projects that dropped off the side. So I'll put that in the chat too. What I'm putting in the chat right now is the resource with different autistic perspectives and activities that we've done on that. But I love, actually, I just finished listening to it on Audible, and then I ordered the hard copy. Have you heard of Into the Magic Shop by James Doty?
I haven't.
Oh my gosh, it's so amazing. So he is a neurosurgeon, and he was I was really active in Clubhouse for a few months back when the pandemic was pretty strong and I was bored and didn't have anything better to do. So he had a few different rooms in there that he would do. And so I bought the book like a long time ago, but I just finished listening to it. So it's about his journey from childhood into adulthood with basically Eastern medicine and like meditation and those types of things. But he just does an amazing job of explaining how all of that has benefited him as a neurosurgeon. And he created what he calls the alphabet of the heart. So he has this, like, I don't have it memorized. It's part of why I wanted to get the book. But he has like it starts with, I think, E, and it goes through L. So it's like empathy, and I don't remember what all the other ones are, and then love is somewhere in there. Love is the last one. But he talks about how, like, he's done research on how compassion can improve people's lives, and like what it does, like when people have connected relationships, like what effects that has on their like physiology and things like that. It's really fascinating. So that's my current favorite. But I don't really read a whole lot of like fiction books. I read things that are psychology or memoirs and things like that. So like Nudge, I haven't read, but I have them in my, either in my list. I can't remember if I bought them yet or if they're just on my list, but Rebooting Capitalism by, why can't I remember his name? Anthony Biglin, is supposed to be really good, but I haven't read it yet, and I'm really excited to read that. Blink, I haven't read it yet, but a lot of people are talking about Think Again by Adam Grant as being really good. So that's like, if I showed you my bookshelf right now, you'd see mostly popular like psychology books or books about autism. Those are my two big ones that I look at. But I'll put the book list in the chat in case anyone's interested in it.
All right. Well, anyone have questions? You can raise your hand in the audience interface, or again, write it in the presentation den. And if not, we'll have a lot of other pre-written questions. See, P-Town is writing. Or maybe we could alternate. What are your thoughts about ISCA creating new functions for problem behavior? And he's referring to the Fisher article. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah. I hate the Fisher article. Just be honest. I have a podcast episode on it. I'll put a link in the chat. But the Fisher article, to me, is exactly what is wrong with research in our field. It's trying to prove something that doesn't need to be proven, taking precious time away from people with developmental disabilities to demonstrate, again, something that didn't need to be demonstrated, and creating supposedly a problem behavior. They trained hitting a button or whatever. It's just, I can't believe people even consented to that research, or that it got approved by the IRB. It just seems like such a waste of time to me. But anyway, I have a whole podcast episode where I go through it in more detail, line by line, with criticisms. I don't think there's any actual evidence to show that the PFA ISCA process creates new functions. They didn't do it correctly the way that Fisher's article talks about. How they supposedly conducted the ISCA wasn't even how you do an ISCA. So whatever they did might have created new functions of problem behavior, but it wasn't the process that you're supposed to follow when you're doing the PFA or ISCA. So I don't think that there's enough evidence to suggest that there's any concern for that. However, and I think I talk about this in the podcast episode as well, what we do doesn't happen in a vacuum. I've conducted regular functional analyses where I know in those sessions that we are definitely affecting that person's response class. So to think that when you're doing a regular functional analysis, you're not having some impact on the person just because you're in like a sterile room of some sort is ridiculous. Like every time we do a functional analysis, we are changing the learning history of that person and potentially creating new functions anyway. So I think there would need to be more research to show somehow that it's like more of a concern with the ISCA process than with functional analysis in general. But I think that's just a risk in any work that we do. When we intervene and change the environment, we are changing the trajectory of the life of that person, whether it's research or intervention. And we need to be aware of that, and we need to really be looking at the cost benefit of doing that and whether or not we should be subjecting people to things like that just to prove that our research line is better than someone else's. Because I don't see what benefit any of that research that Fisher did had for the people that participated. It literally had none. So if you can't tell, that's a hot button topic for me. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really important too. I guess it's a fairly standard Hanley criticism that when you're doing a traditional or an analog FA, you might have the individual engage in dangerous behaviors in the first place,
Yeah.
It's not like analog FAs are completely free from their own sets of problems.
Exactly. And that there was actually a discussion on the PFA Facebook group, I think just yesterday or more recently, like yesterday or today, about like that I kind of debate or whatever. And that is one of the things that someone brought up is, anything we do isn't going to be without criticisms, and we always want to be looking at how we can improve what we're doing. Then one of the main differences between the PFA ISCA process and like traditional functional analysis is that there's a much bigger focus on the safety and well-being of the person who's receiving the treatment. I've heard some horror stories about places that have done a ton of research on FAs and the level of challenging behavior that the participants were allowed to engage in because of the research that was being done for, that benefit supposedly. So having those safeguards in place should be the top priority.
Well, and then pursuant to that, big question, normal BCBAs aren't doing FAs. How do we change that?
I don't know that we need to change that. To me, for the functional analysis, there's so much I could say about this one. So I talk about this in, I think, my challenging behavior, navigating challenging behavior. I talk about it, and in that workshop that I mentioned that should be up on the site soon, I talk about it. I can't remember if I talk about it. I might even talk about it in that podcast episode I just posted. But basically, Hanley talks about this in the Behavior Analysis and Practice 2012 article on functional assessment. But a lot of the times, just like basic behavior management isn't being used. And like there are skill deficits that need to be addressed. So I think first we need to make sure that people are really comprehensively looking at the chain that's occurring and what skill deficits exist that need to be addressed, and what basic behavior management strategies aren't being used that could be added to the environment. And when you make those changes and you're really spending time and effort on like really analyzing what's necessary for the learner in those contexts, a lot of the times whatever challenging behavior was occurring drops off. It's usually relating to these skill deficits and just inconsistencies in how the environment's being managed in the first place. If the behavior is persisting, once you've made those changes, then we would want people to be conducting the functional assessment, whether they use PFA or FA, like traditional FA or whatever way they do to figure out what the function is. If you do it before then, if you're trying to figure out function before you've really addressed if there's skill deficits or other environmental changes just in general that would need to be made to have a better learning environment, you might not even get an accurate assessment of what's going on. So for example, I had a client who engaged in really high rates of head banging. He would bang his head on floors, walls, glass, whatever, you name it. He'd had several concussions. He was only 3. And his mom, her best friend was a BCBA. She was really good at looking at the function, especially even in the moment, what he was trying to get out of the situation and making sure to withhold that from him. But when I came in and assessed, he had a ton of skill deficits around just regulating his response to things. So he was genuinely mad. And what did he do when he genuinely got mad? He banged his head. He was frustrated. He banged his head. He was sad. He banged his head. So every physiological, emotional response that he was having, his learned behavior was to bang his head over that. So we spent a ton of time working with him on how to show calm, how to show mad, how to be sad, how to put language around that. And then, of course, we worked on slowly also tolerating, things that he perceived as aversive within the environment, because even if he was genuinely mad about things, he would be mad like 99% of the day because any tiny change that happened for him was very difficult for him to navigate. So we taught him how to navigate those difficult times as well. And he went to hardly ever headbanging. If I had only looked at function and that's it, if I had just been like, okay, let's do an FA and figure out, what's going on here. And obviously I wouldn't have done a traditional functional analysis because it was headbanging, so that probably would have been too dangerous. But if I had just done that, we never would have, if we would only focused on the consequences and we just need to withhold this stuff, he never would have made any progress, and he would have continued to have high rates of headbanging. So I think when Iwata looked at developing functional analysis, the whole reason it was developed is he was working at Johns Hopkins in Maryland, and they tasked him with developing something. How can we find a way to figure out, why these patients are doing what they're doing? And he came up with these different conditions based on research that existed at the time and based on the population he was working with. Keep in mind, the population he was working with when those initial studies were put out in the 80s was not the same as the kids that we're serving today. Completely different populations almost. These are not people in, inpatient hospitals. They're not as significantly affected from a cognitive standpoint. So the way that and the things that need to be addressed are probably drastically different than what he was looking at and researching at that time. So anyway, I have a lot to say about this, obviously, but I think the first thing is to make sure, because people are just doing cookie cutter procedures and they're not individualizing or really looking at what their learners need to be independent and to navigate the world. So that needs to be the first priority. How do we train people to really individualize and analyze what their clients need to develop these skills? And then if problem behavior or challenging behavior still persists, that's when we need to make sure a functional assessment is occurring and that function-based treatment is being provided. But even then, the function-based treatment doesn't need to incorporate extinction. There's tons of research to show you can use differential reinforcement and still make progress.
Yeah.
This is one other podcast. I can't remember if this is the one where I talk about all that or not, but I'm putting it here just in case.
Yeah, and that really hits a lot of notes of big problems in ABA, huh? In terms of it's really that master's level clinicians that have no idea what they're doing.
Yeah.
To put it bluntly. Anyone else have some questions? You can write in the chat or come on the stage and talk, or we could go back to the pre-asked ones. What are your guys' thoughts? Well, it looks like someone's typing. Fire Zara? Well, it didn't ask me anything. I'm sure if you're interested in psychology, you've got some
Sire, I'm
question
sure
to
you
ask.
could ask, whatever you want. It would be a great question.
Right.
Well, I talk too fast, so that's part of the problem, probably.
Well, I'm sure if you hang around here, you'll pick up some stuff. Okay, so how are you feeling, Dr. Miller? You think you got some more questions in you, or?
Yeah, I think I can go for a little bit longer. It's fine.
Cool. All right. So I think we already asked how you ended up in ABA. Why have so few people heard of behaviorism?
Well, so when I did my undergrad, I was at a school. It was a small school in Ohio, and small private school, and we even had a rat lab, and we had a learning course, and I didn't even know about it. And I mean, I knew about it. Like, I knew that those two things existed, but everyone made fun of Dr. Larson and her rat lab. And the person who taught the learning lab, everyone said was really mean. So I didn't even try to learn anything about it. So I think part of it's a marketing thing for sure, even in undergrad. Like, there are some schools that have these things, but the way, the university, even the university faculty talked to us about the rat lab and the learning lab was not beneficial, obviously, for us to learn about those things. So I think part of it starts at the university level of there's always been some infighting and things like that with behaviorists in the psych departments, and it's hard to find schools where they all kind of get along and support each other. So that would obviously be helpful if we could get psych programs to put, more effort into helping students learn about the behaviorism. But even there's been research to look at intro psych books, and most of them don't accurately describe behaviorism. So even the textbooks are flawed. So obviously that should be fixed as well. And then just how we interact with mainstream society. Like, when I was in Clubhouse, I had a lot of opportunities to go in these different rooms where people were talking, and almost everyone that was like really popular, the stuff they were sharing was all behavior analysis, but had been remarketed and branded by other people to make more connections. So there's Tiny Habits. I don't know if you've heard of that, as like a very popular thing right now, which is basically just shaping. You could be a habit coach. You can get trained and certified in it. So I think a lot of it is about how we talk about it. People want to insist on us using our own language and being very kind of robotic and rigid about it, instead of looking at, okay, what would be meaningful and connect with broader society? How can we, talk about this in a better way? And obviously Pat Fryman does a really nice job of that. But he's mostly working in, pediatrics and things, and he's not a BCBA, which sometimes people, I don't know why, I think that that's like the end all be all, when obviously he has much more training and expertise than any of us. So yeah, but I think the biggest piece is how we talk about our field, and doing a better job of looking at what people want to hear about and how they want to hear about it, and creating our messaging based around that.
Yeah, guess that kind of touches on the next question of why behaviors are so bad at marketing their science.
Yeah, well, because none of us are trained in that. And for some reason, whenever like our ethics code and stuff was created, there was a really big focus on like not doing those things. I think it's because at the time, like historically, there were people going around marketing behavior modification and like doing harmful things. And so I think like they've swung the pendulum too far and basically being like, you can't do any marketing or anything. And obviously that's not going to work either. So having, better, whether it's we get trained or we have, companies that we engage marketing folks to help with the messaging and things like that. But it definitely is a weakness.
Definitely. Why do you think lay people are so enamored by IQ?
I saw that one and I was thinking about that too. I think part of it is because of the emphasis that was put on it by like the schools, at one point, and just like society in general, that was like a big factor in people getting put into specialized and advanced things. So it kind of became this highly regarded measure, but in reality, like most people that study it know that it's not. But that never really changed. Like they haven't switched to any type of new way of figuring out, how people might potentially excel in different things. So I think until that changes, if like, the people who make use of IQ to make decisions, until they shift away from doing that, I think the like lay people are still going to value IQ.
Okay. What's an area of practice that could greatly benefit from behavioral practice but currently isn't?
All of them. I mean, honestly, the education system, even though behavior analysts and like the science of behavior analysis and learning has had a presence in education for a long time, it's still not made use of broad scale. So I would say, like, in terms of especially how bad our education system is failing, the more we can incorporate what we know about the science of learning, the better. Kim Behrens is doing a really nice job of that with her work, with her book and the different podcasts and, public presentations she's been doing. But in general, I think that would be where we could have the most impact. Because if we could really improve what's happening in the schools, especially from a young age, then that would obviously impact other areas of society.
Yeah, ABA has so much to say on education. It's kind of sad that it's really locked away in, like, at best special education, and then even then not really. What do behavior analysts have to say on treating psychopathology?
So we had a course on this in my grad program. I would say that it's probably not where it should be, because behavior analytic research really started in that some of the initial research in the 50s and things were in mental health hospitals and really working with inpatient populations. But then as autism became more of a focus, then that kind of changed. I think there's a mixture. Like, I definitely remember learning and reading in grad school some of the articles around like schizophrenia and things like that, where a lot of discussion was had around the symptoms not necessarily being real, and it being, I mean, they're real to the person, but like that you could operantly address a lot of the things that were happening. But I think there's a balance that needs to be had, because there are ways, and people have talked about this, that like, especially from the neurodiversity movement, there are things that could be happening for someone and you just try to slap on like an antecedent behavior consequence approach to that, and it's still putting a Band-Aid over the deeper things that are happening for that person. So I think, have like synthesizing, especially the work that's being done with ACT and neuroscience research, positive psychology, cognitive behavioral psychology, and what we know about behavior analysis, and having, whether it's treatment teams or somehow one person who's specialized in all of those things, but really pulling all of that together would be the most beneficial for looking at psychopathology, because any one of those just working with someone, there's probably aspects of like a holistic approach that would be missing for that person.
All right. Have you ever worked in a law enforcement as a behavior analyst?
I have not, but I was the discussant for a presentation at ABAI where one of the presenters had been in the military, Kent Corso. He's a clinical psychologist in the DC area. One of the presenters had been in law enforcement. John, I can't remember his last name, but he was in Ohio. He was a police. And then one of the presenters, Abigail Culkin, is a precision teacher and behavior analyst, and her husband was in the military. So they each presented different topics around either the military or like police and police violence. And then I've just done some like random readings and gone down rabbit holes on it and stuff like that, but I haven't personally worked in that area.
Do you work mainly with kids?
Yes.
All right. We talked about your first job. I believe you said your undergrad was in psychology, right?
Yep.
What can you tell about a person just by looking at them?
Not much.
Yeah.
I'm probably one of the worst. I'm one of those people who's really just like trusts and believes that everyone is like ready to do nice things. So sometimes that bites me. And but yeah, I don't think there's a whole lot you can tell about someone just by looking at them. Maybe depending on like what clothes they're wearing, I might be able to tell if there's a certain sports team they root for.
Right.
That's about it.
What is OBM, and how is it different from industrial and organizational psychology?
So OBM is organizational behavior management. And when I did my undergrad, I actually was part of the IO Psych. They had a SHRM club. It's like human resources management, students human resources management at John Carroll, and I thought I was going to do IO Psych. So I did take a few classes in it. The main difference, and then of course at Florida State, I studied with Dr. Bailey, who's a huge OBM person. So for me, the main difference is that OBM relies very heavily on a observational approach. So really like what can you observe and measure objectively? Whereas IO Psych does aim to do similar things, but at least in the classes that I took, there was a bigger focus on like more like Likert scale, kind of measures of like personality and different things like that, instead of really pinpointing and having like clearly measured goals and things. That in OBM, that's the really big focus, is looking at having very clear pinpointed measurement systems for employee performance and feedback, and then also looking at like the systems that are in place and how you can make those operate more efficiently. I do think for IO Psych that there are pieces of it that are beneficial, to complement an OBM approach. And especially as a behavior analyst, a lot of times we don't put a whole lot of stock into like the personality measures and things like that. But there are a few out there now that do have some pretty good research to support, at the very least, even if it's maybe more of like a placebo effect of some sort, it helps. I don't know, it helps people align and feel connected to like put labels on who they are, of like, oh, I'm a this color, or I'm a in the like that's the disc, and then there's the EFN, what is the one where you get a number. So there's like the enneagram, so there's like the different ones that generally speaking, you could read them and probably any of the descriptions, you'll be like, oh, that's me, that's me, that's me. But for some reason, it helps people to be like, oh, this person's a that and that person's a this. And like, we just love to label and categorize things. So sometimes that can be helpful if you're creating teams and trying to help people learn how to work better together, to have those like very like concrete, oh, this person's this type of personality, so this is the best way to work with them or whatever. For whatever reason, that can help kind of decrease a lot of fighting and like stress that occurs when people don't understand each other in that way. But generally speaking, as behavior analysts, those types of things were like, well, that's a bit mentalistic. You can't really see any of that stuff happening. But if it helps people perform better, it helps people perform better,
Right. What's your thoughts on information theory? This is another theoretical one. Could it bridge the
Yeah,
gap
this is
between...
one. I don't know if I know what that is. Can you explain it briefly?
No. Maybe Peter.
Then I don't have any thoughts.
But yeah, I don't... You want to explain it for us, P-Town? Take that as a no. Okay. Is EAB dead?
I don't think it's dead. Like, people are definitely still geeking out and studying. There are publications that are still made. I do wonder if it needs to be more progressive. If they're like, it seems like with some research, people just get kind of stuck and they kind of study the same things and don't like synthesize in, okay, well, what have we learned about neuroscience that could inform new EAB research and stuff like that. There was Massacoria had a behavioral observations podcast episode. I think Dave Cox talked about some of this stuff because he's a very unique behavior analyst that has done some really interesting things. So his doctorate, I think, is in like law, not ethics. And then he did some research on like psilocybin and the different treatments that are being created to use psychedelics as an intervention. And I feel like he touched on some EAB stuff in there, but I could be wrong. If it wasn't him, there's definitely at least one behavioral observations podcast episode where someone is talking about EAB stuff. Well, I think Dave was talking about like a lot of like big data things, and he pulled in EAB a little bit there. So I don't think it needs to be dead. I think I'm not an EAB researcher, but if they want to keep moving things forward, really looking at other research that's being done and like advancements being made in other areas that are, related, could be helpful for that and make it, continue to make it a bit more sexy and exciting.
Yeah. I think you said the answer was no. Did you ever worked in an animal or basic operant lab?
No, I never did. And even I never even had to do, Sniffy, the rat, that like computer program.
I did that in my graduate program.
Yeah, so some people did that, but I never, I don't know why I didn't have to. I didn't have to for some reason. So yeah, I did go to chicken camp. That was fun. But I had a chicken. It was very interesting. So I don't know if you all are familiar with chicken camp, but there's a woman up in like Washington who has done a lot of work. She's very popular with precision teachers too, but she has like this whole program, and you can go to her place and do it, but they had brought her in to Hershey, Pennsylvania, and I went then. And they get these chickens that are newer chickens that haven't had a chance to like experience the world. They have like very specific ways of raising them humanely. And then at camp, you learn how to do different operant, procedures and things like that. And you start out with very simple, just like clicking and then giving the chicken a pellet out of this like feeder thing. And then you work on teaching the chicken to peck a red like dot chip, poker chip. Then you work on discriminating between the red chip and like a different chip. And that's pretty much all you work up to, because it's just like 4 days. But my poor chicken did not like going in and out of the cage. So the first couple of sessions, she was amazing. Like, she was probably the top of the class, like learning things so well. But then after a few times of going in and out of the cage, when we would get her out, she would just freak out and she would start like flapping her wings and trying to get away from us. She'd poop on the table. And the training sessions are only 5 minutes long. So by the time we'd finally get her calmed down and on the table for her session, we only had like a minute left. And it was fascinating to see how quickly she fell behind her chicken peers because she didn't have the same training time that they did. And she didn't have, she had so much of that stress happening for her. It was just like such to me, it was like so similar to what a lot of our kids that have different developmental disabilities experience. And I begged the instructor, like, she does not like going back in her cage. Can one of us just sit back here with her until we're done? And she wouldn't let us do it. And I felt so bad for the chicken. And she eventually like only learned like half the skills because she was just so stressed every time we would put her in and out of the cage. But isn't that fascinating to see how quickly, you know, a student could go from like very high performance and then you have this like stressor happen and then they can't even learn.
Yeah, at the SCS conference, did you attend the Wolf talk? I don't know if you were
The
there.
wolf talk. No, I didn't get to go to a lot of the presentations because I was working.
Yeah.
It was here, it was where I live. So it was like very hard to do both.
Well,
what was it?
so this, I think it was Dr. Bullo, but I'm not sure. And his grad students did concept formation with wolves. And, they plotted on the standard acceleration chart. But what really struck me is how they were able to teach these wolves like all these learning to learn behaviors, entirely through just like shaping. And it feels like a lot of human behavior analysts can learn a lot from like animal training in terms of, managing behavior in a more humane and safe way.
Yes. Yeah. And that's what a lot of the research at UNT is based on shaping. And they have their animal lab, but they also have, actual educational labs as well. And I haven't seen it in action, but one of the people when I did the Morningside Summer Institute, Darren, he was going there. There was two people, but he was the main one I talked to. He was getting ready to start grad school there, and he was talking about how for their education labs, they're pretty much only allowed to use shaping with the students. And for me, again, anything where it's like you can only do this is a bit problematic because it's like, is that really the best all the time? But it would definitely make you have to flex your analytical and problem-solving muscles a lot more if you had to if that's all you were doing was figuring out how to shape the responses.
Right. So we have a live question. Why are precision people always into the ISCA and vice versa?
I'm not sure. I'm trying to remember how many different precision teachers I know. The main thing that I would say, though, if that is true, would be because in precision teaching, as long as I've known about it, and like if you look back at older articles and things like that, they've had a heavy focus on assent always. So really having the student buy-in and having them actively participate in their learning and their interventions and all of that type of stuff. So the PFA ISCA process is a lot more aligned with that than like a traditional functional analysis would be. So that, to me, would be part of the appeal, but I'm not 100% sure. I haven't talked to people to find out what's drawing them to it.
Why don't any undergrad psych programs really teach ABA anymore?
I don't know if they ever did. Maybe back when like Skinner was really popular, but I don't know that they ever really did. So that's part of it. Like I said before, the intro to psych books don't even accurately describe behavior analysis most of the time. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done to collaborate better with the other, theoretical perspectives in psychology and really I don't want to say defend it, but be more like open and curious to find out why people aren't accurately understanding what we do, and then address that first. I think a lot of the programs, because of ABA and autism, there's been a ton of growth in the master's program. So also, making use of that and teaching that, would be helpful for the students. I know, Kirby and Beverly Kirby talk about how they have made a lot of success in the DC area, especially with the Black colleges, and getting them to focus more on behavior analysis by showing the job outcome benefits for their students. Because a lot of colleges want to, that's one of the data pieces that they report is like people getting jobs and like good jobs. So if approaching it from that angle of like, hey, if your university, incorporates this content and has a focus, your undergrads are much more likely to get jobs in these areas. Because like what area of psychology can undergrads really come out of just with a bachelor's degree and actually get a job? It's very rare. But in behavior analysis, they could as an RBT and potentially a BCABA. So that should be a huge draw for universities. But I don't know that many people are putting in the effort to explain that to universities.
Right. Why don't, does behavior analysis ignore thoughts and feelings?
Some behavior analysts do. The science doesn't. And that's where that third wave of behaviorism article is really cool in talking about all of that. But even Skinner acknowledged that emotions and thoughts exist and that they are behavior. He just also mentions that they're hard to measure and all of that kind of stuff. So most of the behavior analysts you'll find that are focusing on that are in the areas with like ACT or trauma informed, some who have maybe a dual background in like social work or counseling and behavior analysis are more likely to incorporate those things as well. But it's definitely not something we can't focus on. It's just something that a lot of people ignore because they say it's not observable.
And isn't focusing on behavior alone reductionist?
Yes, probably. I think it depends on how you define behavior. So if we're looking at everything being behavior, like emotions, physiological responses, everything, I would say focusing on observable behavior alone is probably reductionist, because we all exist. We know that we have inner things happening. And we are like, when we're responding in the environment, it is not just based on the antecedents and consequences that are observable that we're responding to. So to try to act like it is definitely reductionist. Does that mean there's definitely situations where you can just look at what you can observe and make some changes there and you'll see changes in behavior. But there's also situations like what I was describing to you all before about the client I had that engaged in headbanging, where if we had just looked at the observable antecedents and consequences and focused on that, we probably wouldn't have seen any changes for him. Like, we had to look at his physiological responses, how he was expressing his emotions, and like what chains were happening for him to really make a difference. So there's definitely times where it's parsimonious and makes sense to just look at that, but we also need to be making sure people are getting trained to incorporate context and really look at those inner behaviors too.
Okay. What's your favorite psychological theory?
I don't know that I have one. I'm really fascinated. It's not necessarily psychological theory, but I'm really fascinated by the research that's being done on stress right now, especially in neuroscience. I always forget the guy's name. Hold on. There's a guy, went to this presentation. There's a group, I don't know, I think it was started by a mom. It's called Bright and Quirky. And they had this presentation last year where they had different people give a 15 or 20 minute talk on different topics. And there was someone that was doing research on stress that I just thought was really fascinating. But I always forget his name. Hold on, I'm trying to find it. Let's see. I keep getting ads. Like, now that I've talked about it here, as soon as I open Facebook, it's probably going to come up. Because I just keep getting ads about it, too. Let's see. Almost there. Do you have a favorite one?
Me?
Yeah.
I don't know if you call it a theory, but right now I'm really into the Israel Gold Diamond, like, nonlinear contingency analysis.
Yes.
So I'm almost done with the blue book, and then I'm going to dive into the nonlinear contingency analysis book by Lang and colleagues. So pretty fascinating.
Is that
stuff.
the newer one that just came out?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen a lot of people posting about it recently.
It's really. Have you ever read the blue books?
No, I'm really bad about reading things.
It definitely. He talks a lot about functional analysis in more of a broad scientific way that I think is really fascinating, and that I think a lot of behavior analysts have lost sight of. And talking about like the entire context of a behavior, so like ABC, so antecedent, behavior, consequence, just really isn't enough, and even with like adding in motivating operations and conditional discriminations. But then there's also other things like looking at this neutral things in the environment might be contextually important, or other sets of SDs that are happening. It's very rarely just one thing. Like, we're not rats in a Skinner box.
Exactly.
So, really fascinating stuff. But I think especially for anyone in here, but especially behavior analysts, it really makes you think a little harder about what we do. And I don't know, it feels like we've lost a lot.
Yeah, we've definitely, there's, like you talked about with that question on about it being reductionist, it's like, I don't think that was the intention. Like, obviously with Gold Diamond and like inner behaviorism and contextual behaviorism and all of that kind of stuff, it's like, yeah, there was a lot going on in the 70s that just kind of fell by the wayside, especially I think as, you know, our field just expanded so quickly and the focus shifted to autism so much that a lot of things were lost. Because how would it even be possible? I went to grad school in 2005 to 2007. My professors, Dr. Bailey and Dr. Murphy, were my two main professors. They'd been in the field for 20 years and they trained me, and even they didn't cover a lot of that stuff. But when our field expands from 3,000 of us in 2007 to over 50,000 of us in 2021 in a 14-year period, who trained all those people? And what kind of training did those people have that were like, I know people who are teaching in the online programs who just got their BCBA like a year ago, and they're teaching college level courses on them. Like, what? How does that work? I don't understand. So, and that doesn't mean, you know, anybody who does online or got, you know, certified recently, nothing against them. It's just, there's a lot of work to be done to like really help people understand the really intricate aspects of our field.
Yeah, it's weird because on one hand we're a very old field, and on the other hand very young at like the same time. It's kind of weird. P-Town asks again, what schools have the best behavior analysis doctoral programs?
Doc programs. It depends on what you're looking for. So, like if you're trying to be a researcher and that's where you're going to stay, probably like UF would have one of the best doc programs. But if you're looking to be more of a practitioner and to train people to be good practitioners, then you would want to find a program where that's a big focus. And like, I don't know that Hanley was still teaching at Western New England, but then with the shift and everything to having FTF, I'm not sure if he is still taking on students or teaching. If he was, I would suggest him, but not anyone else at Western New England. So it kind of depends on like what you're wanting to do. Ohio State's program is interesting because it's in the special ed department, like I mentioned. even though Cooper, Heron, and Heward were at Ohio State, a lot of the people working there now are more from a background of special ed. So if that's your area of focus, then that would be a great program. USF, like I mentioned, has a lot of different options for lines of research, and every single person I've met that went and got their doctorate at USF, I've always loved the research that they're doing, and it does seem more practical and like, oh, I could actually do something with this. I'm mostly familiar with the programs like over this way. I know obviously like out on the West Coast, there's quite a lot of programs as well. But to me, it's more about what is it that you're looking to do, and then finding where those folks are, and working with them. Fire. Yes, exactly. Polyvagal theory. So the Stuart, I posted for the stress thing on the favorite theory, Stuart Shanker was one of the ones that I was just like fascinated with what he was talking about with stress. So I posted a link about that. And then there's Porges and Mona Delahook that they do a lot in the area of the polyvagal. Most behavior analysts probably don't agree with it because it's about the brain and like inner stuff that they would say is mentalistic, but especially Mona, the different resources that she's created and ways of talking about things and making that shift and reframing how we look at what's happening for people that might be engaging in challenging behavior. I think learning about that and then figuring out how you can synthesize that if you are a behavior analyst is really beneficial. Then just it kind of gets back to what you were talking about, Stephen, where it's like there's so much other stuff going on, like what with Gold Diamond was talking about and things like that, and we've really simplified and reduced things quite a bit. So looking at things from people like Mona and Stephen Porges and Stuart Shanker and these other areas like neuroscience and parenting, and really looking at, okay, what kinds of things are they talking about that we could pull into our practices that would still be aligned with like a behavior analytic approach, I think is really beneficial for especially folks in the field who maybe haven't gotten that more like well-rounded understanding of the science and how we can look at things from like a more contextual or inner behavior way.
Okay. A couple more because we're hitting up on that 2-hour mark. What do you think of Jordan Peterson?
I was like dying when I saw this question. I don't like him.
Okay.
I think so. It was really funny because I had a friend who we had just started. We had known each other for about a month, and had been talking like every day and had really great interactions. And then one day he was like, I love Jordan Peterson. And I had this like visceral emotional response that I was not expecting. But like all I know about like, and all I've seen with Jordan Peterson is a lot of really ism type things, especially like inflammatory and like especially about women. So I was just like, what? Like, how could this person that I'm friends with like Jordan Peterson? I don't understand. I had never heard of his initial stuff, whatever the 12 things are, that book or whatever. So I contacted my other friend who's usually pretty aligned with my views and whatnot, just to see like, why was I having such a reaction to this? Because he's also very curious and open. So I knew like if there was anything redeeming about Jordan Peterson, he would know what those things. So I contacted him and he was like, oh, well, the 12, whatever. I don't remember what they are. What is it? The 12
rules for life, I think, or something like
yeah.
that.
So he really liked him for that reason. And I was like, okay, but what about all of this other stuff? And he was like, yeah, that stuff's kind of crappy. So then more recently, the friend that had told me he loved Jordan Peterson, he's like, I actually think I don't like Jordan Peterson now. And I was like, wow, okay. And he realized it too. But basically, like, this is the discussion we had. It's like, it seems like he does have some really amazing information to contribute. And the 12 things was like really helpful for a lot of people. But then something happened. I don't know if it's just like he's in an ego space, like way too much in an ego space. And it seems like just trying to be one of those people that can say things to get more reaction and more people to follow and like engage with his stuff than like genuinely understanding anything. So there's quite a few things he's put out where it's like he clearly hasn't studied or learned anything about what he's talking about, but he says it with such confidence and like he's an authority on it. That's what bothers me. Anytime anyone is coming from an ego space and then talking about stuff with authority that they don't even understand and they've never researched, and it's just to get a rise out of people, I'm not usually going to like that. So he could be a very nice person and have a lot of really great things to say, but I just haven't even really ever paid much attention to him because of
Okay, I think we talked about your favorite book. You dropped the link of your whole reading list. Some hot names in ABA right now. Did we already ask that question?
I don't think we've talked about it specifically, but I mean, obviously, we've mentioned Dr. Hanley a few times. I think it's interesting because like who you ask is probably going to give you different answers on that. For me, the people that I think we should be, attending presentations and learning from based on what they're studying and talking about. I've kind of talked about them already, but Dr. Hanley, Murray Serta, Ashton Holt, Malika Pritchett, Tyra Sellers, Shala, Eli. Sometimes you'll see Rosales, but those are some of the ones that I really learn a lot from and benefit from seeing what they're talking about. Adrienne Bradley, she's up in Michigan and usually has a lot of really great information as well. Hillary Laney is down here in Florida. She just moved, but she's done a lot of work with understanding PFA SBT process and looking at how to train practitioners and really improve the practice of it, and help people like critically think about what they're doing with it. We talked about Camille Kolu. I'm sure there's others, but those are like the ones that come to mind right off the top of my head. Now, whether or not someone else you asked could potentially give you a different answer, but those are the ones that I feel like I'm learning the most from right now.
Right. What are some findings from behavioral research that are useful for the average person?
I mean, I really think the shaping piece is the most important, both with our own practices, but also for people in general to really understand that, like, okay, you might have this big goal you're trying to reach, and if you can figure out what the baby steps are to get there and like celebrate and reward yourself for those little pieces instead of just being like, oh, that goal is so big and it's so hard to get to, then you're much more likely to have your changes in behavior and then actually achieve your goal. So I think shaping is probably the biggest one.
What are the limits of operant learning?
Oh, there's so many. I think it goes back to what we were talking about with Gold Diamond and whatnot. You really can't just reduce things to stimulus response consequence. Yes, in a lab setting, in very simple rote learning type situations, it can work quickly and it's easy and it's great. But in the larger scale, especially if we're looking at group contingencies or big behavior change, there's so much more that needs to be taken into account, and chains of responding that involve stimulus response consequence, but also, again, considering context and what could be going on from an inner behavior standpoint, needs to be looked at as well. So I think the two big things for me is, one, if people think that that's all that matters is stimulus response consequence, then they don't really understand the science. And then the other is that it's not appealing to mainstream. They want us to be complex, and we are complex. So if we always, try to simplify things and say, oh, it's just stimulus response consequence, getting that buy-in and trying to get a more behaviorism out there is unlikely to happen. So really accepting and acknowledging that like there is a lot going on, and yes, there are times where we can simplify to stimulus response consequence, but other times, you know, we need to be looking at the more complex pictures and things like you would see in Gold Diamond's work and like the nonlinear analysis and stuff like that. People are going to be much more likely to accept something like that.
Okay. And now that's been 2 hours. I don't know if you want to look through the list and pick a final question that you're really itching to answer.
Pull it up. Hold on a second. Definitely don't want to answer the Freud question. Did that. Okay, let's see. Some of these I definitely can't even answer. So I'll do, there was, what was your first impression of psychology during undergrad classes? So for I was really fortunate. My intro to psych class, my professor was really great. He actually, his name was Dr. Bottomer. He was a visiting professor from Washington, and he was also, he did animal research and had like worked in chimpanzee refuge in Africa and stuff. So he was fascinating. He did a really great job, obviously covering learning and whatnot, yet still I didn't know behavior analysis was a thing. So I loved his class, and I just like was fascinated with everything in intro to psych. And then the next semester, or maybe I can't remember which semester it was, but I did clinical psych, I think. And that's when we went over each of the theories. And on like the very first class, the professor said, so none of these are actually effective except for maybe cognitive behavioral therapy. And I was like, why are we here? If none of these are effective, what are we even doing? Why are we getting a degree in this? I don't understand. But she still went through all the theories, and we had to learn about all of them and like, you know, how people use them and whatnot. But I was just like, it's amazing I even continued to pursue the like focusing on that for my degree. But that was like I just remember that was like one of my biggest, like, what is happening right now? I don't remember what the textbooks were or anything like that, though. I was an undergrad a long time ago. And then the last one, would you say that any of your clients have affected your mental stability in any way? To be honest, no. Like, it's actually, for me, but I'm fortunate. I've mostly worked with early intervention and learners who have like some challenging behavior, but it's not like super intensive. So for the most part, if it's affecting my mental stability, it's in like a positive way. Like it's just having like seeing their progress and being able to celebrate like every little thing that happens has been just amazing. I haven't had even my most like, you know, quote, stressful clients, it's never been to the point where it like affected me in any type of way. But I do know people who've had cases where it did have that effect on them. And it's obviously important if you're working in the psychology field in any manner, whether it's as a behavior analyst or anything else, to have resources for that, whether you're, you know, getting your own counseling or you have certain friends that you can like work through stuff with, or you have your own, you know, meditation or different things that you do to kind of take care of yourself and reset things. But I've been fortunate that I just haven't really had any situations come up like that. Sometimes I take on too much and then I have to reevaluate and shift things. But the only thing that ever really affected my mental stability in this field was when I had my own company and we were doing insurance-based services, and it was just like one fire after another, and like people, the employees that we had weren't really like grateful for any of the things that we were doing and like sacrifices we were making. So all of that like businessy stuff definitely affected my mental health, but then I just transitioned out of that. So, but I haven't had any issues with clients affecting my mental health.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for donating, 2 hours of your time to come and hang out with us and share your expertise. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thanks for having me. I love all the different questions you all come up with, and it's been fun chatting with you.
All right. Well, for everyone here, our next AMA is next week. We have a clinical psychologist coming to talk about CBT and rational emotive behavior therapy. So I'm sure that'll be really interesting. Again, Dr. Miller, thank you so much for hanging out, and have a good night. Get some rest.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you. I hope you all have a good night too.